Halo, selamat siang waktu Indonesia bagian Barat, Timur, dan Tengah. Good evening, New Zealand Standard Time. My name is Grace. I'm a member of the Jakarta Biennale 2021 ESOK curatorial team who runs this monthly event in forms of panel talks, conversations, lectures, etc. As a way to sort of open up our working process to the public, also as a way to engage with the issues that we are unraveling in the making of the biennial. And not limited to, but oftentimes sort of focuses on exhibition making part of the biennial. This platform is really where we rehearse our thoughts, expand our research, as well as collect potential interests of the biennial stakeholders. And it is through this platform by inviting fellow caretakers or experts, if some of you like, we hope to be taking an active role in the discourses that we want to be working with. Before I begin, I want to thank the team behind the screen, JJ and Chamai from the multimedia team, Rachel and Chita, also Sally and Chingy, the curatorial team, Ibu Dolo, Farah, Ari, Ening, Ninus, Livi, the big Jakarta Biennale team. The panelists, Vera, Cassandra, and Pitra, of course, and all of you for being here with us in YouTube and Facebook. The thought of doing this panel departed from a casual conversation that Vera and I had about navigating day-to-day chit-chats that is somehow disabled in physicality, yet continue to happen in the internet. And oftentimes through text, either via chat messengers, various social medias, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitch TV, you name it. And by text, I mean informal, casual texts. In these conversations, little things that we never had to pay so much attention to kind of slips away more and more. Things like tonality, dialect, affect, or any kind of emotions. And sometimes it turns into emojis. It is easier to get a grasp of these things if you know the person who is typing or have ever been in a room with them. You'd remember their body gestures, accent, vibes. Even so, chances to misunderstand them are not non-existent. It must not have been new for many of us to have like silly fights with our best friends, partners, family members, or colleagues that we have known for decades due to misreading their text. Vera and I were talking about attempts to connect friends, colleagues to each other, those who have never previously met in person and have not had the chance to get to know each other's work, practice, let alone life. We were particularly intrigued by the failures of connecting our mutual friends. I remember we were, quote unquote, accusing the general wokeness in the current social media culture for it. We were comparing between institutional tendencies for political correctness that in many cases happens merely on a performative level, and the time people spend for hashtags that they would use for their social media posts. But we were not constantly cynical about it. There is still chance for this to not to remain performative, that the more people and institutions exercise their political correctness, they might embody it sooner, hopefully. I thought of Pitra, a dear friend of whom I share office space with, who have been striving towards inclusive technology. And nowadays, a big part of that area would be internet and the social manner in it. Anyway, I'm not going to introduce everyone's professional bios. You can find them in the Biennale's blog, our social media, even in the description part of YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching it from, viewing us from. And Vera thought of Cassandra, who's eager to converse the difficult things. Being the history buffs that we are, we started looking into various instances, occurrences, events, happenings, artworks from the past. I mean, even wokeness is not a new internet phenomenon. The Oxford English Dictionary traces the use of the word to 1962. Wikipedia traces it into something even older. I mean the use of the word woke in political cultural awakeness kind of tone, not simply as the past participle from the word wake. So here we are. Thank you, Vera, for the sublime title, Talking Across on Unfamiliar Ground, and for assembling the framework of this conversation. Groupings or labels that package and divide our cultures into neat boxes and binaries have never accommodated our nuanced and complicated personal and political positions, be it based on race, ethnicity, nation, religion, gender, or any kind of division, really. We cannot speak simply of the East against the West, or even strict functions of self and others. Given these complexities, how do we talk to each other, particularly across the periphery, when we decenter the West as the central pivot point all cultures pass through? How do we understand each other from a mutual unfamiliarity when we remove the conduit of the center? How do we hold a space for duality and contradiction in a time which demands affirmative cultural positions? This panel will discuss and draw upon different cultural positions in the arts and international solidarity movements as a starting point to think through the complications of positioning, particularly in relation to displacements, diasporas, and exiles, ranging from artists Emilia Sunasa, Pachita Abad, to the surrealist support of anti-colonialism, to the diverging political posturing of the Asia-Africa Conference 1955 in Bandung. This panel is an open thought experiment. We will begin with Vera, and then go to Cassandra, and then Pitra. Each of you will have 15 minutes. And even if it's almost always tempting to immediately respond or comment or debate after another, but let's just go through all three presentations and then we talk afterwards. During the presentation and the conversation, for some of you who are viewing this session live, I invite you to send your thoughts, questions, comments, agitations, or any responses via the chat or comment box. And then I will try to weave it into the panelists' conversation. Okay, thank you again for being here. And Vera, the floor is yours.
Hello. Thank you so much, Grace, for the framework and the outline, and of course, the invitation to, I guess, share some of our informal conversations in maybe a more open and exclusive manner. So what I'm going to discuss is, a thought experiment. I'm not conclusive about any of these positions, but I thought I would dive a little bit into some moments in history, some cultural points that I've been thinking about in relation to solidarity and how to understand each other, particularly I think when we're talking from a position of existing on the periphery, so it's not this kind of straightforward us and them position. What if, we all exist in the us, or that we're all kind of part of the them? How do we understand and converse with a level of nuance that doesn't fall back on very easy positions of nation and of kind of essentialisms that I think often shape a lot of our So I'm going to share my screen. I feel like it's easier for me to think with images. So beginning with obviously the sculpture that is, made by the artistic director of the Jakarta Biennale, Dolorosa Sinaga, Solidarity, I guess prompted me to think about the word solidarity and its meaning in English. I mean, obviously, I'd love to hear more from other people in the various dialects and languages present today, if it has a different kind of root meaning. But in English, it draws from the word solid, obviously, which has a meaning of being dense. I think in the 16th century, around 1530, it kind of gained this meaning of being dense or hard. And in the 18th century, sort of solidified its meaning, as you could say, to mean entirely of the same material. So something that was solid was also made of entirely of the same material. And in terms of the word solidarity, it reflects the idea that there is a communion of interests and responsibilities. So yeah, I guess reflecting again on this idea of communion, how to be responsible with each other and towards each other, and how do we have a communion of interests? Yeah, we might have the same interests, but we might have different ways of going about them. I was particularly fascinated in this sculpture with the gesture of the arms. I mean, I'm making an assumption here by thinking that this is a sculpture of women holding each other in solidarity with linked arms across their bodies, but also this one figure who punches up into the air. And reflecting, I guess, on how, within Indonesian art history, there's quite a strong current of monuments that have this figure of the free figure, you could call it, in public space. So this is the Irian Liberation Monument by Edison from 1963, with his arms gesturing towards the sky. Again, this kind of movement upward or towards the sky as a moment of freedom. And in other Edison sculptures, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, there's a lot of gesture of hands and arms in different directions, as if they're sort of synonymous with freedom and movement and liberation. And I guess thinking about solidarity movements, it would be hard to sort of ignore one particular global movement that keeps recurring in my reading of the region's art history. And that is, of course, the Bandung 1955 moment of solidarity across Asia and Africa. So a moment of solidarity where two regions came together in the face of imperialism and sort of positioning themselves as mutually anti-racist. I think what's quite fascinating about the Bandung 1955 Asia-Africa conference is that the Asia and Africa, of course, are two very different regions. And what kind of, I think, united them in this particular instance of solidarity governmentally. So, obviously it was a formal solidarity movement. It wasn't sort of necessarily, as you would say, from the ground up, but that there was a feeling of mutual oppression. It wasn't necessarily shared political belief, shared religion, or, even shared sort of motivation, but that there was an understanding that they were both sort of, these two regions were colonial subjects, were tired of that, and needed to find a way to sort of emancipate themselves from their Western powers and to gain allies and friendship as a way to sort of advance themselves as independent nations in the world. What's particularly interesting, I know I've talked to Grace about this, is the kind of image archive that's left in its wake. And I started to think more about the image of solidarity as well, thinking about these particular sculptures and how they celebrate moments in public space, as we saw with Edison, as we see with the sort of Dolorosa Sinaga piece as well. And the image archive left by Bandung I think it's quite fascinating to see, for example, these very iconic photographs that you can find very easily online by Lisa Larsen, who photographed for Life magazine at the time and was a photojournalist in attendance at the conference, and her images of the crowds in Bandung. So obviously a lot of Bandung people, Indonesian people came to see the spectacle of what became known as the Bandung mythology. And in this particular image here, the sort of, I guess, celebration of the various different cultures that were politically in attendance at Bandung, one of them being Chu Enlai, the China's premier, this kind of right-hand man of Mao, was there. And members of the crowd sort of costuming themselves in a way to sort of show their support of the different political leaders that were there. One very important interaction which happened at Bandung. So this figure here, Richard Wright, was an African-American journalist, activist, and author. Wrote very sort of, what's now regarded as very important novels such as Native Son. He was African-American, but also lived in Paris, so sort of was quite closely connected to a lot of the Pan-Africanists and people associated with the African liberation movement. He attended the conference quite famously and wrote a book called The Color Curtain, which describes his interactions at the conference. And one of those interactions is with the Indonesian journalist and writer, Mokhtar Lubis, who's in the middle here. And the interaction between them has sort of been well historicized and well played out in various journals and periodicals, including this reflection here, this historical reflection called the Indonesian Notebook, which is a source book on Richard Wright and the Bandung conference. And it's kind of, I guess, a critique of Richard Wright's perceptions of the conference at the time. So Richard Wright, obviously being from Jim Crow's America. So, you know, at the time when in the United States, there still is and still was, you know, incredible sort of discrimination against Black Americans and African Americans. He was obviously very excited to be at the conference and to see this kind of interaction of Asians and Africans together, and has this quite famous passage where he very talks in a lot of detail about the different races and how they interacted at the conference. So he talks about Muslims and Arabs and kind of like brown skinned people and yellow skinned people. And the languaging is, I guess, very much of a moment and has kind of, I guess, been critiqued as well, because he focuses so much on race. And in some ways, now we can kind of reflect and understand why that was, given where he was talking from his position as being a racialized Black American. And that was quite critiqued by, for example, Mokhtar Lubis, the Indonesian journalist and author who met with Richard Wright. And so Richard Wright had the opportunity to meet with a lot of Indonesian journalists, as well as other writers and other cultural figures in Indonesia, and kind of interviewed them. And Mokhtar Lubis sort of critiqued Richard Wright and his romanticism of what he saw at Bandung. So Mokhtar Lubis was quite critical of Richard Wright, calling him sort of colored crazy, and that like all these racialized terms that he used to describe Indonesian people were not necessarily terms that Indonesians used themselves or necessarily saw themselves within, because, you know, obviously it's like the 1950s and this period of internationalism takes on a sort of different flavor during this moment. And what's quite interesting to think about in terms of this period is there's a number of sort of iconic speeches from leaders that were in attendance of Bandung, you know, leaders that were recognized as sort of pioneering independence in the global South. And so President Sukarno himself, who was, Indonesia's independence president, in his opening speech, which I've only seen in English, so I'd love to get an Indonesian translation, uses the kind of terms. He says, "This is the first gathering of colored peoples in the world." And I think what's quite interesting to pick up on is this idea of how he how Sukarno uses the term colored peoples, how Mokhtar Lubis, the Indonesian journalist who interacted with Richard Wright, says that we don't talk on those racialized terms, but actually this language of racialization starts to enter sort of a more sort of governmental level in Indonesia. But I think the translation of colored peoples into Indonesian, orang berwarna, doesn't necessarily have the same meaning. So this idea of, as well, of like transliteration and where it does land and where it doesn't land is quite fascinating. I thought I'd bring up this poem by Indonesian artist, poet, playwright, Rimi Selado, written from 1976. I'll read out the English translation, which is my translation, so it might be quite badly translated. But the poem's called Asia-Africa Solidarity, and it goes like this. Mei Hua is a 16-year-old virgin. Farouk is a 16-year-old bachelor. Mei Hua goes to bed at midnight. Farouk goes to bed at midnight. Mei Hua unbuttons her blouse. Farouk takes off his pants. Mei Hua takes off her skirt. Farouk unzips his pants. Mei Hua takes off her bra. Farouk takes off his singlet. Mei Hua pulls off her underwear. Farouk pulls off his underwear. Mei Hua is stark naked. Farouk is stark naked. Mei Hua puts on her nightdress. Farouk puts on his robe. Mei Hua gets into bed. Farouk gets into bed. Then they sleep. Mei Hua is in Taipei. Farouk is in Cairo. And I think what's quite clever and cheeky about this poem, which is, called Asia-Africa Solidarity, is it's kind of has this almost quite sexy and scintillating and, salacious build-up. And actually the sort of punchline, if you will, is that, they're two figures that are in completely different locations. And, they're kind of united in their sort of humanism, if you will, of going about their nightly ritual in the same way, but they never get to copulate or consummate. The solidarity is kind of like parallel, and I think that's quite a clever critique on this idea of transnational solidarity, how at some level it's so similar, and it's so there's something very kind of universal about where we are as people in different parts of the world and how we're united under these sort of political frameworks, but actually the sort of it doesn't quite happen. And this painting by Hendra Gunawan from 1953, I think the provenance is questionable, if I'm correct, Grace. It's not, we're not sure if it's actually by Hendra Gunawan or if it's actually from 1953, but it's called Asia-Africa Storm. And it has these kind of mythical animals descending, if you will, from the heavens down into into Earth. And Asia Africa, you could say, would be represented by the various animals, the dragon, the elephant, the lion, the bull, for example. But for all the critiques of Bandung, particularly from that book, Indonesian Notebook, which tries to unpack whether Bandung really was this beautiful moment of solidarity. The fact that there are these certain images that keep recurring that add to the mythology of this sort of famous moment of two unlikely regions coming together, I think is quite fascinating, to the point where, there could be an artwork, there was potentially an artwork from the 1950s that was sort of made, in anticipation of it. And it's here I shift to another different context, which is in rural Cambodia, actually. And these are paintings found in pagodas. So they are found in Buddhist worship halls. And they exhibit, all the paintings in these Cambodian pagodas exhibit the same stories, which are stories relating to the life of the Buddha. So there are sort of set stories that are painted every time and that you can see recurring all over Cambodia. But one that I wanted to focus on, which I think changes, the representation of this particular story changes in the 1950s onwards. And this narrative is known as the distribution of the relics. So historically, the story is known as after the Buddha dies, what happens is that his human remains are distributed to prominent leaders, and those leaders have the responsibility to then, take them, and that's kind of a symbol for the way that Buddhism is then spread around the world. But what's quite fascinating, and it's, I'm sorry, the image is quite bad, but in conventional depiction of these murals, so these stories have been depicted in sort of sculpted bas-relief, and you'll find them at, for example, Angkor Wat, or in very all over the world where Buddhism is worshipped, which is, many parts of the world. And the depiction of foreigners, so there are always foreigners present at this particular scene. But I think what becomes quite interesting is after the 1950s and 60s, and granted this is rural Cambodia, this is not like an urban metropolis, is that diversity also changes. So while you might have, the earliest depictions of the scene, foreigners look just like normal, regular people with and they might have a hat to show that they're different, or their nose might be different to show that they're different. But what we start to see happening is that this idea of the foreigner becomes much more nuanced. And I need to have a more detailed, but what I think is quite fascinating is that the Africans start to appear within this narrative. And I can't think of a situation, for example, in Cambodia, where in painting Africans are also depicted, particularly from the 50s and 60s. So I think in that respect, it kind of shows that, this kind of mythical moment of global solidarity through the Asia-Africa conference did kind of travel. And in this particular scene, so you'll see it more pronounced. And, they're kind of quite crude depictions, they're essentialized depictions. So you'll see at the back here, there are two Africans fighting over an urn that has the remains of the Buddha. You'll also see a Queen Victoria figure, you'll see some Arabs, you'll see Indians. So the world in this scene, which, beforehand maybe did not look this worldly or diverse, suddenly starts to look a lot more nuanced. What I quite like about this particular depiction, which is from the 1960s, is at the back here, next to King Sihanouk, is an African figure, and he's wearing a pith helmet, which, if we think about the image of Africa, pith helmets are usually worn by the colonizers, not necessarily the colonized. So there's kind of an interesting mistranslation happening here. We also see, for example, the scene at the Buddha's funeral, where we have the leaders of Bandung in attendance. And I have a more sort of, so for example, we have Mao that attends the Buddha's funeral. We also have Nikita Khrushchev, who is from the USSR, JFK attends the funeral. So same with Sukarno and UNU, Prince Sihanouk, and Jawaharlal Nehru from who's India's prime minister. And so the fact that these kind of political figures enter a very traditional Buddhist story, I think becomes quite fascinating in terms of who has access to the narrative of enlightenment, which becomes more and more diverse, I think, as the media culture associated with politics expands. And I thought I would just end on this document actually that Grace shared with me, which is from the sort of French Surrealist journal in 1947. And it's the title is "Freedom is a Vietnamese Word," and it's it's signed by many of the major surrealists, such as André Breton, where they're sort of advocating for an anti-imperialism, and that surrealism, this movement, which is, I guess, often seen about, is often kind of characterized. If you think about surrealism, it's this sort of artistic movement which aims to make the familiar unfamiliar, and vice versa, to make something unfamiliar familiar. So what we have is a lot of surrealists, quite a few of the surrealists, traveled to Southeast Asia, gained inspiration from the region. I thought I'd do quite a direct comparison here between the Max Ernst painting, The Stolen Mirror from 1941, and The Gate at Angkor Wat. But that actually this movement also had quite staunch anti-colonial resonances. So within that text, freedom is a Vietnamese word, which was written actually in 1947, so well in advance, I mean, during the sort of conflict in Indochina, but well in advance of the American war in Vietnam in the 1970s. And it also accompanied an exhibition in 1931, which was to expose the truth of the colonies. So basically how I was just, I guess, trying to show an example of there's a reciprocal exchange of solidarities in a way that we have the Surrealists gaining inspiration from Southeast Asia in quite a direct manner through image appropriation, which obviously is not unproblematic, but that actually in the colonies too, there was an expansion of this idea of solidarity through these big political moments, but also through understanding that the world became a more bigger and complicated place, and how to represent that. Yeah, that worldliness became, I guess, a concern. It was a concern back then, and I guess it still is now. So I think I will stop there and hand the mic over to Cassandra, if that's okay.
Oh, thanks, Vera. Kia ora. First of all, thanks, Vera, for your beautiful talk and beautiful images, which I was really grateful to see. And we'll get to talk more about that later. And kia ora, Grace, kia ora, everybody, for inviting me. Ko tēnei taku mihi ki a koutou, ko Cassandra Barnett aho no Raukawa, ki Aotearoa. So I just said that I'm from the tribe of Raukawa, Māori tribe in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm very grateful to be here amongst you all, so thank you. So I have got something much more personal and anecdotal to share. And it's just a series of stories from my life, but which I think do speak to the themes that you introduced at the start, Grace, and those issues which you evoked through the example of texting, of what gets lost in translation, what gets lost across cultural communications, etc. So I've written this, I got it this morning and I wrote it. So I'll be reading, sorry about that. Okay, so 2020. I go to my son's classroom where he is taught entirely in Māori for parent-teacher interviews. I speak with the teacher in my pidgin Māori, but mostly listen while she tells me how well my son is doing and how beautiful his reo, his Māori language, is. I am proud. My grandchildren may yet grow up in the language I and my grandparents lost. My son reports name calling in the playground, where everyone speaks English for the sake of the Pākehā kids, the white kids. Poo face is a popular one because my son is African too, and his skin is black. About this, I speak with the teachers in English because there must be no mistake. Yes, it is his Māori classmates calling him names. I hear a week later from my son that there was a talk about it in class. During the course of that talk, his teacher taught the kids a word I won't repeat here, a word she was called when she was young. She was trying to help. Suffice to say, things got worse, not better. Suffice to say, he bans me from ever talking about his troubles to the teacher again. My son slowly gravitates towards the non-Māori strand of his school, picking friends among the white football kids. They don't use those words. At home, he rages at me day and night until the day I ask him on impulse, "Are you mad at me because I'm not black?" He replies simply, "Yes." 2021. I am employed to write text for a new visitor centre at the Native Botanic Gardens, specifically to bring a more decol angle to their message. I go to work meetings, the only Māori in the room. I am like a wind-up doll repeating myself robotically. How about we include some Māori plant motifs amongst all these colonial botanical drawings? How about we use Māori symbols instead of Western icons on this timeline of pre-colonial histories? How about we don't imply the forest was unpeopled, original, primordial, unchanging before the settlers arrived? How about we call Māori scientists, gardeners, conservationists too, though our own words would be better still? More robot words run in my head, unsaid. How about we skip the enormous drone view of the forest and gardens on the tabletop? How about we skip the imperialist gaze? How about we use wānanga, the Māori style of problem solving, where everyone gathers and talks and listens, elders down to grandchildren, before we make big decisions about what knowledge we're giving away, what we mean by ecosystem, what we mean by endangered native species, what we're asking of our visitors and their children. Is it really just plant more trees and lay more traps? Or might we want to shift their mindsets too? But the experience design company says back robotically, if we do that, you'll blow your budget. You'll miss your deadline. We need to draw a line under this project or it'll just drag on. Think of your visitors. They don't want to be overwhelmed. They don't want to read. They just want messages that can be understood quickly. But then, when we do meet with our region's tribal authorities for sign-off, as we must, because this is council work, government-funded work, my employers are suddenly docile, acquiescent, fawning. Turns out they know a real Māori when they see one, or hear one speaking fluent Māori, reciting the incantations. And those ones they are afraid of. 3. It's 2019. An event is held in Wellington for Black creatives of all ages. My son is only 7, but I desperately want him to go. I want him to get what he's not getting from me. A smart, creative, activist, futurist Black community, a family of people who look like him, are African diasporic like him, share experiences with him, can support and inspire him in ways I can't, and his troubled dad can't either. I won't attend the event, of course. I'm not Black. His dad says he might take him, then doesn't. I messaged later with the organizer and hear that his dad did go and took his white girlfriend, breaching protocol, making a scene. Just as well my son missed out. We love his dad, by the way. 4, it's January 2011. A PhD student, I attend the Kiha Colloquium Other Views in Johannesburg. It is hosted by the South African Visual Arts Historians, or SAVA. My accommodation in a gentrified suburb has barbed wire fences and 3 layers of gates and locks. We are weapons checked when we enter the university each day. Despite these signs, I am stubborn, naive, idealistic, stupid, solipsistic. I refuse to ride the white buses. I'm not white, I say. I say it to my Black guide in Soweto, and she looks at me like I'm crazy. And I am. I catch the minibuses instead, using the hand signals I've read up on in my rough guide. Everyone on the minibus talks loudly with each other, ignoring me and my madness. I give my paper about an artwork by a Māori artist, Lisa Reihana, depicting a virtual Māori ancestral meeting house, or marae. I talk about the effective ways in which it makes me, colonised old me, feel more at home than I do in many actual marae. My new conference friend, who is French and Madagascan, comments, "We are opposites. Your paper is utterly personal. Mine is utterly political." Words in my head trail out silently, unspoken, but mine's political too. The next day, I attend a paper by my compatriot, Jonathan Mane-Whioki, a rangatira, a senior leader, trailblazer in Māori art histories. He describes how the work of Māori modernists, artists like Arnold Wilson and Selwyn Muru, need not at all be viewed as a westernisation of Māori customary practice. On the contrary, through the workings of whakapapa, or Māori genealogy, which run both forwards and backwards, these Māori modernists have brought Western artists into an incorruptible Māori world, into the old Māori world even. They have, he says, put Picasso in the marae. It's a Māoriizing of the world, not vice versa. It's a power move that keeps the Māori world intact, unthreatened even by Picasso, the master primitivist himself. 5. February 2011. A month after Johannesburg, I am in Atlanta for another conference. Then I visit my dad, who is living in Alabama. We take a trip to Selma. I'm wearing my high tops and my Senegal tie-dyes. You could call me an appropriative mess or crazy, and I am, but I know what I'm doing. They can tell you're not from round here, my dad says, half bemused, half embarrassed. Some locals cruise by in their car, windows down, shouting, "Nice shoes." My dad's eyebrows go up. He's Māori too, but he learned in another era to toe different lines. Still, nowadays, I dress straighter, whiter. It's just as much of a performance, but it does less harm. 6. September 2012, my son is born. 7. October 2014, Jonathan Manefioki passes away. In all the years since then, I've never seen or heard that Joburg speculation of his discussed in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Perhaps we're not ready to put Picasso in the marae. Perhaps we've moved on or back from courting or taking under our genealogical wings the Western art world, the way those Māori modernists did anyway. And of course, we'd be better off without that world, that global capitalist art system. And perhaps we're unconvinced by those kinds of self-empowering counter-colonial moves. Perhaps they're all performance, but ineffectual on the ground. Perhaps leaving those old white ways for dead is the only way, even if they're in us all. Still, on some personal level, I hold Manefioki's ideas dear. I hold it dear for the transcultural, transtemporal, transgressive thoughts they allow me to think. If Picasso can become old-time Māori via his artistic descendants, then, corrupted as such desires may be, perhaps my son and I can ride the whakapapa genealogy minibus together too, to some futurist, ancestral, speculative marae where we all the way belong together. So that's what I wrote. I've just added a little comment afterwards that yes, that's utopian thinking and maybe it doesn't help, though it helps me. And my dangerous thought is that maybe we always need to overspill our boundaries a little to get things moving, to make conversation and thought happen. We need to run past what's acceptable, what's emotionally safe for ourselves and others, not just to learn more clearly where the lines are, but to learn where they aren't too. Shalda, it's me. Thank you. Sorry, I should have passed the mic. Pass the mic to you, Pitra.
Thank you, Cassandra. Oh, I sometimes feel a little embarrassed to hear a very personal note, but at the same time, also proud to be in a space where it's, yeah, I hope it was comfortable for you to share the notes. It's very insightful, and of course, coming from personal experience, these are the types of forums that I have been trying to be present in. I will be saying this many times, to expose myself to try to reveal what is probably something that's left at the back of my head because of the embarrassment, the guilt, and possibly the social construct that have created me in my state of trying to not be ignorant, or trying to familiarize myself with many differences. I'm not sure if that's the main choice of one's life, but I want to say that it's I find many guidance, but also confusions in talking about our mere existence in this changing worldview. I noticed there are some click words and some, the ideas that stems from how we perceive injustice, social inequality, and because English is also not my first language, so I tend to also absorb the very technical terms, and having difficulties, of course, to sometimes have the assignment to translate, to transliterate, or to just adapt, and trying to internalize the meaning, although it's not, of course, many of them are indirect experiences. So I've also made notes on what I've been doing in terms of this these kinds of forums that I wish to, of course, it benefits myself, considering my growth. I feel that I have the responsibility to at least witness, if not, if that is what is, the bare minimum on being present on these kind of discussions, without trying to, of course, I would say that the main goal is to not dehumanize ourselves, is also to be able to speak clearly about the state that we're in. I'm saying this in general words because it also has an impact in how, there's constant or probably continuous thinking on why the revolution hasn't started. I mean, it's probably something that is annoying a lot of people when there are major changes such as the pandemic, and that there has to be some kind of big change, or there are massive, it takes a lot of energy to experience the impact. So how can we prevent ourselves from being in this state again? Of course, it's very this is speaking about gaze, it's also a gaze from a person who feels that oneself can be empowered to make and take decisions that will not endanger, that will not cause further crisis. So let's just say these are the breadcrumbs from my attempts to be present. Earlier this year, I recently co-organized an online gathering between art workers based on the western side, living on the western side of Indonesia, with art workers from Tanah Papua. So the reason I'm saying Tanah Papua instead of Papua as an island, or Papua that was divided into two provinces. Of course, the division is making me even more reluctant to say the word Papua, as in an ethnic based, or as a unit of geographical position. Therefore, I would use Tanah Papua as what the I would say what the activists have been using to unify, or maybe unify is a bad word, but to establish this notion that it's not divided into the current provinces, which is the West Papua and Papua itself. So my co-organizers for the activity initially did not consider themselves artists due to the diverse role that they need to take on. And these are diverse roles, as in, you know, domestic roles, of course. They are, this is a meeting for especially art workers, female art workers. So they themselves had some kind of self-induced awareness that they are in many roles, but of course one of the roles is they not by calling themselves artists, because it's not something that is contributing directly to the movement. Nonetheless, I understand that it's challenging to not be aware when you're continuously exposed to inequality and injustice. So I remember ruminating, what shall I name this model of gaze on perceiving people as artists, as people who are individually working in the arts or for the arts, and people who are, yeah, quote unquote, have the space and time to express themselves in a rather artistic way. Or should I be also, should the meeting also include people who are practicing customs, or even doing these practices, art practices, for economic purposes, such as, you know, you would categorize them as indigenous craft, or any kind of production scheme focusing on tourism, because of course there is a there has been major investments on developing these cultural, I wouldn't call it artifacts, but these cultural objects that is not just about trying to, I would argue that it's part of the Orientalism, that you look into these objects and you hope that somewhat there is a pride building within the Papuans. So they would feel that the culture has value and it's being accessed widely. I mean, it's being, you know, the intrinsic value would not compare, because they also tend to, because this is really handmade and everything. So it's clear that the collectibles, the objects that they produce, may very well be a valued collection for people. So it's not something that you would find in marketplace, in regular. Yeah, it should be presented in a glossier, and, you know, I don't know where exactly it stimulates your thinking on this is a valued product, and whether or not it's also Orientalist to look at it that way. But if we look into the culture of museums, it might as well. I mean, based on experience, that the rarity and the skills that were given into that. Although also, of course, there are romanticizing of the people who are making that prefer to not use the money to, or how, even if they receive the value, we're not talking about really colonial museum collection, but it's more of yeah, you would receive the amount of money for your product, but it's difficult also to say that you're someone is not romanticizing the idea of it being handmade, and it's being it needs a special the fibers that were used need special treatment in the forest, and that it connects to the to maintaining the forest themselves. And it is of course something that is very yeah, it's not confusing if you see it as an object per se, but it will be confusing if you try to connect it with the condition of life. And I have started to question that, on whether or not I should normalize just the customs of people living and working to make these products. And by asking them to be part of our meeting, are we also acknowledging their role in the arts, whether or not it's something that they need? But that's also one of the gays that I propose to my co-organizers. So a little on the co-organizers. They are documentary filmmakers. Well, they started out as people who are these are all females, and they want to find the works of other females, of other women. So they go to villages. They go to well, not just villages. They find around them proof of life, proof of existence of the Papuan identity. But soon the works have been developed to a more of the notion of how is it being independent from the system. So throughout the years, I have also seen these friends as people who have never quit questioning themselves in whether or not we should promote a production of say a cultural object, but also trying to find the background, what they want to campaign is about social justice. So they're not artists, they're not activists. I don't think they also feel burdened to label themselves, but here we are. There we were with 23 other people coming from quite the same background, quite the same situation. So another question was, when exposure is accumulated and everyone may feel entitled to influence others with their perspective, can we finally offer a solution? So the solution can have diverse meanings. I don't think that we can always say, again, the solution is to reclaim that independence through diplomacy or through political campaigns, but not so much as surrendering and negotiating or accepting the differences. So there's a bit of gap there that I have often refrained from. I don't feel that, as an outsider, I would feel that it takes a whole bunch of people to reclaim this independence, be it from the political stance. Yeah, of course, it has its own risk, but also culturally, as it was mentioned before by Cassandra, how knowledge is how to, can I say, decolonialize the knowledge. Like I see that there's a lot of appropriation also in accommodating this knowledge as local wisdom. We have that kind of word. A term, local wisdom, is to perhaps make ourselves more similar, ourselves living in the western part of Indonesia, in Java Island, feeling more connected in terms of roots, but also, naming it local wisdom does not make us, if we're talking about local wisdom, then we should be looking at our local wisdom, our locality, instead of trying to establish that in Papua they have their own local wisdom and we should learn about that. I'm not really sure about these exchanges. If we are to meet in a forum and say, I want to find traditional herbs to help my immunity from COVID-19, that would be, is it a botanical study, or should we just not think of solutions from these knowledge? I mean, the knowledge, you don't really know when to harvest the knowledge up into when you're going to use it, but trying to frame that question itself is problematic for me. And so another challenge was to convince myself that hosting these forums and asking one another to be quote unquote exposed was it's clear that we have our differences, and no one would know each other that well, but there is this emotional excess from trying to get out of that space, which I think was described clearly. I don't think I want to go into a way that I want to go to the fact that we are not fully responsible of people in the forums, but we can see that these differences, I mean, not to harmonize very much, but also if you are exposing yourself, is it possible to have to anticipate that other people will support you, and that is the idea of solidarity in a very small scale. So I'm really hoping that more people will come to understand that sometimes it's there are universal values, like, you know, you cannot measure kindness, you cannot measure even someone's presence. But yeah, I think if I may add one image to share here. So these are the 3 images that I know that I haven't been speaking a lot about the people behind the works. These are 3 images. One is from Emilia Sunasa, the left side. All 3 speak about Papuans, and all 3 were made by women. So Emilia Sunasa, the drawing study, and at the center is a photo by one of the forum participant, and you will see the trapunto, the kilt, was made by Pacita Abad. I somehow feel that after our meeting, I would modify my statement on Orientalism, or that gaze, that the problem of gazing, and that probably after a few years, I now see that, yeah, the birds are not murdered; they are being, you know, it's food. And then I would see that the center image is, yeah, it's a comparison of the instant noodles with the fish that was affected. So the waters in the Asmat region has been affected by mining, so it becomes more difficult to find, and also no one can really guarantee that it fulfills the nutrition. But also, as a comparison, there's an easy way of trying to find food from instant noodles provided everywhere, even as relief aid, of course, but also if you receive money for social support, then it comes with the instant noodles. And the last one from Pacita Abad, I think, yeah, these kind of studies are interesting to see when they're reflected back to the people they're being depicted. Although it's not necessarily, because she's done this also with the Maasai and with tribes in Africa. So I'm sure that she kind of free herself from symbolizing really the local aspects. It's debatable if she can, if this work is a representation, but I think, of course, the issue is not for me to bring forth that this is a correct representation or not, because in the end, I don't think we can fully represent, albeit how familiar we are, if it's an expression, then it's an expression. It's not revolting. So yeah, I think I would close it there. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Vera, Pitra, Cassandra. Can we all come to the screen? Hi.
Hi.
Let me first do the moderating job. For those of you viewing from YouTube and from Facebook, please please write in your comments, response, or anything. And our team, Chita and Rachel, will deliver it to us, and then we'll address it in our conversation. It's really, how do I start? How do we go about? Maybe first, I think I will first comment Vera's comment. I think I just want to say one thing. It's really nice to hear that thinking with images is a thing. Because I think I do that a lot. And also it reminds me that we haven't thanked Julian Abraham Togar for allowing us to use the image of his studio for the publication of this talk. And in lieu of that, maybe I go with Cassandra's anecdotal and personal paths and rethink about like relationships, distances, familiar, unfamiliarity. Because I think I suggested this image to the whole group, first to Vera. I remember asking her whether this image would work because we wanted to talk about difficult things and like quite a lot of things with examples that are broad or examples that may not necessarily work together if you put them in like a essay photo kind of setting. So I thought of a completely different image, and this image really came to mind because of the words that you can read in the image. What was I saying to you? I think I was saying something like, do you think this image would work? Look at the signage painting. He's calling it that, signage painting. At least 4 of the signage painting says something that may resonate to what we are going to talk about. The first is, I've never been a fella, but I've always been a fella, but I will never be a kuti. And the second is, we are the machine that we are raging against. The fourth is actively passive. Oh, I think there's one more, but there's one more in the studio, but it's a bit hidden behind the drums. It says, I take no pleasure in saying it, but I think life is good. I remember saying that the image is so loud, it's very static. You can see that it's somewhat a musical setup. It comes from an open studio in Rijksakademie, where he's currently at, where Togar is currently at, and the instruments function independently, like it's programmed, so it runs on the open studio days, but on normal days it functions as a music studio also. There is the feeling of like staticness because it's a photograph, but also, and of course there's no sound coming from photographs, but because of the words it really feels loud, I think, and confused, but also brave. That was why I was thinking of this image. And the studio where this image come from is often used as a jamming station, like where Togar would start playing drum, I think in the beginning for himself or to calm himself down or to just enjoy himself. But then friends from around his studio would come and bring their own instruments or bring food, drinks, stories, problems. And then they would jam, they would play together. The signage paintings are actually his work that he's done over a lot of time. I also just realized that you can see experiments behind me of that. That wasn't intentional, but yeah, it's. I say that it's done over time because initially it started as stickers, tote bags, T-shirts. It's just now he's firm on calling it a sign painting. That is something we need to ask him why. I feel like I'm familiar with Togar's practice because he is my partner. even if I'm not always involved in all his work. But I feel like I'm really close because it's done in like literal close proximity. Like I would be living with him when he's making the work. So I would hear how the thought grows or how he sort of like cross an idea, or I would be able to experience how the idea grows. So I suppose I feel like I should be familiar with what he's doing. Now that we are apart, I really do feel sometimes that I'm unfamiliar. Like, where do this constellation of text, of paintings, of instruments come from? What kind of sounds are generated from these instruments? I mean, I can see a piano, I can see a drum, I can see a megaphone, I can see a gong. I can imagine how it would sound. I can hear it through FaceTime, Zoom, or whatever, or through recordings. But how would I know how it sounds in space, or how my body would react to the sounds? And yeah, I often question, do I even get the gist right? Just the gist, not even the idea, or let alone his statement. How can I sort of be familiar with the issues or places where these ideas come from? Like, how can I understand the disturbed or rage that he felt when people in his daily grocery routine would question if his hair is real, or they would want to touch his hair, or they would question, why are you wearing a mask? It's interesting to think that in this familiar unfamiliar tension, he actually developed one of his projects with Pitra. Yeah, and Pitra, I think I want to thank you for your remark on your stance, like to say Tanah Papua instead of Papua and West Papua, which I myself would be saying it that way nowadays. I don't know if I will change. I'm sure I will change, but at this point, I guess I'm pretty conscious that my knowledge, my empathy, my stance is that limited. And not to comfort myself, but I think it is somehow pretty typically Indonesian, or pretty typically Javanese, to be particular. Or just by Javanese, I don't mean you're ethnically Javanese. You're living and growing up in Java. However, I always try to find. I mean, I am someone who always avoid to be called Indonesian in many different ways. Like, I would, when people write Indonesian independent curator, I would like first cross out the word independent, because no one is independent in like curatorial work. Then you can't say Indonesian curator because I don't know what is happening in Borneo. I don't feel like I don't feel like I am eligible to be called so. I mean, I guess I don't. The only situation in which I don't avoid being labeled as Indonesian, it's visa and immigration business. It's just too complicated to avoid it. So yeah, I guess I represent the general ignorance on intricacies of Indonesian state power, pragmatic politics, attitude towards Tanah Papua. And maybe with this, I go back to what Vera was trying to was elaborating through images. I think I want to maybe say something about unity, unifying, or attempts of being solidaric. Generally speaking, I think the problem is we are all now speaking in English, and it's not our mother tongue. And then this is something that I have expressed in so many ways. But I guess for me, it started with the mistranslation of Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. This would then relates to the differences that we're talking about or trying to talk about. Bhinneka Tunggal Ika is a Sanskrit slogan, sentence, phrase. It is oftentimes translated in English to unity in diversity, which I think is the core of the problem now, or one of the cores, if not being the only one. Unity in diversity emphasizes on the unity part. While I think if I could translate it, I would translate it to the diverse united. Because much like what you were saying about these different Asia, Africa countries, or not even independent ones, there was one thing that they agreed as their problem that sort of made them meet. And it's not about how you become independent or how you rule your country, but it's this one thing in this moment that we do not want, or we want to strive to. So it's more about the diverse tolerating each other, I guess, or deciding to unite even temporarily. I mean, doesn't have to last forever, right? I think that's where I'm at now. And if anyone wants to say something about each other, please. It's the awkward Zoom silence.
Are we freezing? No. I can't seem to see your videos.
Oh, really? You're not freezing. I can see you moving.
Okay. So it's just here, I guess.
Yeah, I just want to thank Cassandra. Kia ora to Cassandra. Thank you so much for and to Pitra as well for being sort of, I guess, so vulnerable to being exposed in position, and how yeah, with, you know, there's no sort of empathy without a kind of exposure, and that the sort of dichotomy, I think, that we're so conditioned by this idea of self and others, you know, like that can be thought of quite differently. And I always think back to sort of, I guess, Buddhism and the professor I work with, Ashley Thompson, the way that she sort of thinks how, you know, we can look like not only at images differently, but each other differently if we kind of break down this self-other divide. And she uses the example of how, you know, within Buddhism, the opposite to the self is not an other. The sort of complement to the self is the non-self, and it's not something that it's not the same as the other, right? It's something that actually has like such a deep umbilical tie to your own self. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to add that, and because of both of the ways that you both unpack your own positions in terms of your own persistence, but also limitation of understanding context in a way, I think, and you know how that our understanding only comes through that direct exposure, and there's no other way to sort of get around that, really. It's only by, you know, maybe like a granular, or maybe what you would call, Cassandra, like a molecular encounter with experience. You know, you have to be there and be open to being sort of, I guess, wounded by a situation. And it's only in that wound that we, yeah, empathize and learn, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, and to keep exposing ourselves, even at the risk of ignorance or the risk of making a mistake, you know?
Thanks, Vera. I totally feel like when you expose yourself, the danger is, I mean, exposing yourself seems to be something to do with in going into a space where you don't have knowledge, where you don't know, the ignorance that we were talking about. And that's, of course, what always happens when we are encountering others. because we don't know their knowledge and we don't know their position and their culture or whatever it is. And so in exposing yourself and being vulnerable and entering that edge space, there's always coming with that danger that you're causing harm to the other or to the other selves that you encounter because you're coming in ignorance and you don't know. And this is difficult because we're in such a time of well, so much pain, so much unsafety, so much potential triggering of trauma, and you know, it's hard times and you don't want to be the one causing that pain. And so it feels like there's a kind of dual responsibility to be prepared to be vulnerable. And also, this is the really hard, I'm not sure about this, I'm making this up on the spot, but also being prepared to be hurt by those that come to you because they don't know, and they'll never come to you if you can't let yourself be hurt a little bit, you know, because your barriers are so thick and you're not going to let anyone in who doesn't already know how to encounter you. So a real encounter is dangerous for everybody. And we all know that from our day-to-day interpersonal, you know, experiences. But when it becomes about groups, communities, cultures, and it's political, of course, there's so much more riding on it. It's so much harder to be prepared to make those mistakes or be wounded, especially if you're from a group that's been disempowered and you're fighting for your space. You're fighting to have a voice. You're fighting to stop being hurt so much. You know, sometimes it's like I don't know which side I stand on. I think that's probably clear from everything I shared. Because I do stand in more than one place, but even in the places where I'm amongst the marginalized, I want to hold to the willingness to be hurt as well, because if that invites people to come closer to knowing me, then I'm prepared to surrender that, you know. I want people to come closer and be prepared to come into my space, my way of knowing. I mean, a cultural space, you know, whether it's a Māori space or, you know, the specific knowings I have, there's so many that won't approach, they won't come and learn. And half the time it's actually because, I mean, sometimes it's just because they're stupid. Or, you know, horrible. But sometimes I know it's because they're scared. And this is like,
yeah, and
I'm different from many of my friends in this regard, I know. And it's because of, it's probably because of things like the fact that I haven't suffered some of the things that others have suffered. I'm white passing, so I don't suffer from the colorist racism, you know, those kinds of things. So therefore I can be one of the ones that can be a bit more resilient to letting people come a bit closer with their ignorance. I don't know, there's some kind of balancing thing there. Making it all very personal here.
but I mean, yeah, like even I guess what I was trying to do as well with the historical examples, like I don't think the solution is to retreat, you know, even if there is a risk of some hurt. And, you know, often that hurt is mutual, right? I mean, it's not necessarily the same. Obviously, there are different positions of power, but you know, the solution isn't to not be exposed or expose yourself, you know, and that's, I think, what my concern is with the current, even, you know, amongst good friends who are well-meaning and politically sound, at the risk of offense, there's a retreat, you know, because we're so afraid to hurt each other. Yeah. But then with that retreat, there's no exposure, you know, and
exactly.
I think the only way to know is through that exposure. So yeah.
Yeah. So how do we all build the resilience for that?
Mm.
I think at least there are two points that I may expand the conversation to. Like one is, I really like the idea of exposing yourself because you have the responsibility yourself. But then there's also this potential of it's unavoidable that people will group you as something else. Whether you agree or not to how they group you, it's just unavoidable. And you in a space where there's more than two people, you are somewhat representing something. Yeah, which is why I have like a template paragraph stating that I do not want to be called Indonesian because it's always the case. Like I don't hate the place, I don't hate the people, but it's too much burden.
Yes.
But yeah, how do we navigate that? I guess how do we navigate that, and how do we navigate the situations in which we are made to represent?
Yeah.
I had another one, but now I forgot it. Maybe it will come back.
I was thinking, Pitra, because you're sort of studying healing and psychoanalysis, and,
I wonder, would Pitra use the word
if there's
healing?
any solution in that.
Well, I'm not sure. Well, I mean, healing, I don't have anything against it, but I do feel that, yeah, eventually time will heal. But I'm just laughing at myself. I'm not laughing at the concept of healing. It is important to know your limits. At least that's what I'm trying to. Yeah, that's always something that I try to express because I know that sometimes I can come off a bit strong with my stance. So I will try to encourage people to, okay, if I'm off limits, please, it will be a big help to let me know where I'm at. So in terms of, I don't know, I want to talk about allyship probably, because we have been mentioning the idea of exposing ourselves and then taking responsibility. And yeah, it's not an ideal stance. I would say even, I mean, if utopia is supposed to be something that's built bottom up, and that it's more possible to attain an ideal, like throughout your life there are like these comfortable, safe zones, but also I don't see that it's stable ground, right? Like you've places that you have felt comfort or you have felt safe before becomes unsafe, not just because you are actively exposing yourself, but it's just because of the change. And having that awareness is actually something quite crucial in the process of healing, of acknowledging where the pain is located. And yeah, I mean, it's if it's treatable or it's something that you cannot really you know, if it's, I don't know, if it's like, if it comes from hatred, or it comes from an angry place, and then it will be more difficult to heal. I think that kind of approach is more appropriate to say that, yeah, our traumas come from how we perceive things. So that's quite positivistic, I know, in a way that you can locate where the trauma is and what pain it causes, and how you eventually you just wait for it to heal by exposing yourself more to, not necessarily to the source, but just by acknowledging that, yeah, I have these angers that is preventing me to heal. So I mean, the technical term would not be psychoanalysis is used as a one-on-one approach, where you counsel your problems and then someone will help map it and identify it. Say an expert would do such a thing. But also, I mean, it's one model. I'm not in the position to challenge that kind of modern approach. But I would say that having the presence of people who are less angry, or people who are willing to contain your anger, also helps. So being face to face and not even talking about the real issue, but just by understanding the excess, sharing food, sharing music and everything like that can also, I actually practice that more than the one-on-one counseling in terms of community care. You cannot really measure the recovery scale. It's not something that you can say that, oh, this client should stop their medication, or is able to. There's this approach on cognitive behavior therapy. So you are also asked to condition yourself throughout certain behaviors, certain positive behaviors, of course understood by cognitive by cognitive ideas. So it's behaviors that are rationalized as the positive traits for someone to be able to navigate. So having someone to consult on that has definitely helped a lot of people, right? Like they can arrange their schedule and they know how to identify, or if they're being anxious or being hurt. And but I see that if the fact is that these kind of treatments are not completely accessible, what are other people for? I mean, if you can still access a community, if you can still access other people and make mistakes together, I think that would be somewhat my utopia in healing.
I like that. Make mistakes together. Just maybe that's the underlying attempt in making this conversation also to make to allow ourselves to make mistakes. And yeah.
It's funny to be talking about music, eating food together and listening to music together, and the importance of being in the same room as people.
Oh, that's another thing.
Room.
Maybe we could talk about walking in the park as well, or other things we can't do.
Well, it's another thing that probably the image we use represent, because it shows lots of instruments, which means people can gather.
Yeah.
And can touch each other. Okay. Do we not have questions from other channels? We can keep talking. I have just one more thing that I am curious to go back to, actually, Vera. It's the Surrealists. How do we talk about them? I think one of my favorable conversations with Vera is surrounding the Surrealists, because they are often only looked at an artistry or an ism or a style. But the more we think about them, there are actual, at least, statements from the people who are doing it, calls and invitations to other people to also think like them, or be like them, or be in the same stance as they are. Yeah, what do you think about them? What can we learn from them? Or something that you're saying along the line of what your professor was saying, non-self. Can we say that in terms of how they are approaching images, artifacts, their skills in painting, as well as their stance, political stance as a person?
I mean, I think, obviously, like, what they did then is really untrendy now, which is appropriate and I go to other places. And I mean, I guess one reason why I'm interested in them historically is because they have sort of a deep political tie to communism and to this idea of universal humanism, that at our core, regardless of where we're from, there's a collective consciousness which unites us. And I feel like that's like such an untrendy thing now to say, but actually there's something, hopefully that we'll return to we'll get to a political position in our world history where you can be curious about others and do that in a way which is respectful. Because I think it's, an example of a solidarity movement, which, although is flawed, the solution is not to stop engaging, right? Like that would be like the worst thing, is if we stopped being interested in each other and curious about each other, if we let our political correctness stop us from asking each other, because we're scared of offending, yeah. So I guess that's what I'm quite interested in with the surrealism movement as well. It's like it sort of it's based in absurdity, you know what I mean? If you know anything about the surrealists, they were kind of ridiculous and humorous and often offensive, but also had this kind of mode of humor and idiocy and, for lack of a better word, like primalness about them. And I guess one thing I enjoy about being around friends that are like me politically or even ethnically is that we can joke with each other. We have this expression where, like, oh, the good thing about being around other people, like people of color friends, is that you can get really racist with each other. And I mean, that sounds terribly offensive, but it's also, there's a lightness involved, you know, like obviously like the world's a heavy place, and it's kind of nice to sort of sometimes make light of these really heavy political things when you're in a safe environment, and that it doesn't have to all be the sort of like traumatic, you know what I mean, encounter, that it can be, that there can be kind of like playfulness and curiosity and lightness that still exposes you to things, but that it can, you know, that humor is also, I guess, a form of of healing in a way.
Yeah, makes me think of stand-up comedy and how it's now, I think it's in that's the only source of humor, because in other instances people are too scared to laugh about things other than about themselves. So that's also the kind of humor that you would hear from stand-up comedy. Like, you talk about yourself, your kind, but it's not it doesn't allow oneself to laugh about things together. You laugh at someone laughing themselves, and it's I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud, how do we how do we laugh together at each other, and sometimes be hurt because that's really offensive, but also to be able to say sorry afterwards. Pitra was saying something like not about harmonizing. Yeah. I mean, not about harmonizing in this harmony in the sense that this is one song, it needs to be packed within its range of dynamics. But I guess I would still go to harmony, but in like a non-ending kind of sounds, like more the day-to-day sound rather than music. Like how your ear gets used to the fact that mosques will make sound actually in like about 10 minutes. how how you get used to the barking dogs if you're like doing meeting with me and I'm at home. That's unavoidable. I can't tell them to like, you need to shh for 2 hours. It's that kind of harmony, I think, is still, or maybe it's one way to accept differences in ability of hearing, in ability of coping with what you hear, and eventually listening.
Yeah, I mean, like kind of like play fighting, you know, and that like you might hurt a little bit. I mean, I guess, you know, when you're young and you play fight with each other, right? Like, I mean, playgrounds, I mean, I guess as Cassandra's anecdote can be really brutal, you know. But if there's a way to do it, which is also, I guess maybe as adults, we kind of lose this sort of space for play in a way.
I feel like, do you think the space for play requires a sense of commonality or a sense of a common ground? Like, it feels like we've lost that trust that we have a common ground that sort of holds us up and within which we can play, laugh, poke fun at each other, hurt each other and apologize. It's like there's this total mistrust now.
Yeah, because everything is a game now.
Yeah.
So in a game, you in a game there are roles, there are rules. In like a playground setting, I would imagine, or school, I would imagine it as a game, because there are the teachers, there are there are this set of rules that are there. But I guess when you say play, it's more like wandering, like no set of rules.
Yeah.
So we sometimes can use these terms to say that we play a role, But the setting in which we operate as adults, as people in like particular industries, people hate it when I say the artisan industry, but it is.
It is.
It is, and yeah, it's kind of like a game because there are sets of rules. Whether you want to acknowledge, abide the rules or not is something else, but it's there. And we don't, as adults, we don't play. We play a role, I guess, but we don't play.
Yeah. Or we find a small, tight community within which we can play if we're lucky. Yeah.
Yes. Do you have something?
I may jump in.
Please.
There's this recent experience on me saying a different thing to my daughter compared to when I was, when I received the lesson from my mother. My mother said that I shouldn't stare at people, especially people with disability, people who look different from me. Just don't stare. It's impolite. Don't stare also means that I don't have contact. Eventually, right? There's never any interaction that's not formal. So I had to, cross some boundaries. Of course, also in the beginning, it was like, oh, I'm doing something bad because my mom said it's impolite. But the way that it is now, that I feel like I have to tell my daughter to, it's not about the staring, of course. I wouldn't say don't stare at people, because sometimes it's inevitable. You look at things, you look at other people as well. But it's more of, don't be afraid to ask questions. I mean, because I would be, very much lacking in information that you will need to navigate your life. It's important to approach people and to ask these questions, which I think might potentially also change in the future. Like, I don't know if we will be in that situation again, like the situation of it's better not to stare, of course. I mean, if it's really bad. Yeah.
I think we are now there. You are now there. Like, we're not allowed to stare.
So I'm a bit late. Yeah. Because, I don't know, like, people are also categorizing that as conservatism, but I'm not sure. I'm not final in thinking about that. But just about now, I feel like I have to send a different message to young children, that it's okay to ask questions about gender, about race, about these things. Yeah. And make these mistakes. I don't know.
Make these mistakes when you are young, or just
yeah, I mean, while you are young, because then I think people tolerate children like humans, don't they, naturally? Like children, they're why would you think that they have mean intentions? I don't know. Yeah, some children bully, I know, but I think it's better to just ask honest questions. It won't be as nice in response when we do it now in our age.
Do you have something else to say, Cassandra or Vera? No, we're good. And if Rachel and Chita don't have anything, I think maybe we can close this for now. Well, we can keep hanging out here, but the YouTube live needs to be stopped. The YouTube live needs to be stopped, and to close so that Chama and Rachel can kill the live thing. I want to say thank you again for all my friends who's here, the panelists, Cassandra, Vera, Pitra, and the team behind the screen. JJ, Chamai, Rachel, Chita, Sally, Chingy, Ibu Dolo, Farah, Ari, Ening, Ninus, Livi, the whole big Jakarta Biennale 2021 ESOK team. And for all of you who has been with us in YouTube and Facebook, I now am reminded, thank you, Togar, for the image. We hope to see you all in our next monthly event, which will be Tuesday, September 28th. It will be hosted by Sally Texania and co-convened with Anissa Rahadining Tias. So thank you again for being here with us. Please cut the live.